This is Breaking Down Security. Welcome, everybody. This is Brian and Mr. Betcher back again this week for another Breaking Down Security podcast.
Yes. And we got a special today. We've got a guest, sort of an expert in the world of ITIL.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about ITIL other than it was something we tried at not Xerox, but at HP, where I used to work in San Diego, and I don't think it was implemented properly. So we have Tim Wood here. Actually, I don't know him, but Mr. Betcher does quite well, I guess. I never got to meet the gentleman until now, formally. So welcome to the show, Tim, and maybe you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be on our podcast today.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invite, guys. I was a former work colleague of Brian's at Xerox, and I've been using the ITIL framework in the UK and the US since 1989. I've worked with 24 different organizations helping to implement ITIL-based best practices, and I'm one of an estimated 200 people with that breadth of experience, knowledge, skills, and experience worldwide. So I'm really glad to be here today.
Wow,
that's impressive. I'm going to go out on a limb and say you're not from around here.
That's right. I'm originally from England, Brian, and you asked me to tell a funny anecdotal story about the differences between the UK and Texas, where I currently live, as you know. I used to work with a guy who was in the Army Reserve, and his job in the Army Reserve was a sniper, and he used to take part in sniping competitions, I guess you'd call them. He was once stopped on I-35, which goes all the way through Texas and outside of Texas as well, traveling from Austin to San Antonio to a sniper competition because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And the highway patrol pulled him over and asked to see his ID. And when he got his wallet out, the police officers saw that he also had a concealed handgun license in his wallet and said, just out of interest, do you have any weapons in the vehicle with you? And my buddy said, yes, I've got 3, actually. I've got a semi-automatic pistol in the glove compartment. I've got a sniper rifle in a wrapped up on the back seat. And I think you better take a look at what I've got in the trunk. So they both got out, opened the trunk, looked inside, and my buddy had a rocket launcher in there. Oh. And the police officer said to him, well, your concealed handgun license covers the rocket launcher, but I'm going to have to give you a fine for driving without a seatbelt. And I just thought that just about sums up the difference between the UK and Texas in one funny story.
Yeah, DPS don't bat an eye at a rocket launcher, but God forbid you don't have your seatbelts on.
That's right. Or you're talking on a cell phone.
So you said that you are one of 200 people who have the breadth of knowledge you have. So you've worked for 24 different companies. Are you primarily going in as a contractor, or have you been permanently not assigned, but have you been a permanent employee of these companies when you were doing this?
Yeah, it's a combination of both, Brian. I was very lucky to work for HSBC Bank in the UK. And in 1989-90 time, HSBC had a requirement that everybody that worked in one of their IT shops became ITIL Foundation certified. And that really started my career in process improvement and best practices based around ITIL. I was lucky enough to move to the US to be with my wife, who's from Austin, Texas, round about the same time that ITIL was really taking a foothold in the US. And so I leveraged the experience that I had and set myself up as an independent consultant at that time. So, yeah, I've had several full-time jobs in the US, but most of the organizations that I've worked with have been as a consultant, a contractor, usually for a 15 to 18 month period. That seems to be the optimum time for implementing multiple best practice based processes with underpinning tool sets and training the workforce, embedding a new culture, all of the things that you really need to do to ensure success in this space. And so, I've been here for 13 years. And so some of the projects I've been on have been very, very short ones, 12 to 16 weeks. Most have been 15 to 18 months. And so as a result of that, yeah, the number of organizations that I've worked with is in the 20s.
Okay, and you've worked with a wide range of companies, I would imagine. From, you mentioned banks, where we talk healthcare, all kinds.
Healthcare, a lot of financial institutions, Capital Group of companies in San Antonio, USAA in San Antonio, Northwestern Mutual in Milwaukee. As you said, healthcare organizations, a lot of state agencies as well. State agencies, especially in Texas, seem to be a lot more slow-moving than privately held organizations, and as a result, they're really kind of adopting best practices and having an understanding of ITIL and how it can help IT shops in organizations like state agencies now a little bit further down the pipe than some of the early adopters.
Okay. So you've actually gone above and beyond a lot of our guests and actually created a PowerPoint presentation that you're going to kind of brief us on how we can use ITIL to boost our information security effectiveness, if you will, in the business sense, right?
I have. Really, this presentation is in two halves. I figured that a lot of the people signing into the webcast may not know anything about ITIL at all. So rather than just jumping straight into what it is, I thought I'd talk just for a couple of minutes about why was there ever a need for best practices in the first place? And that takes us back to the early 1980s, actually. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on that, but I thought it would be useful to talk about why ITIL was even needed in the beginning, how it grew, what it is, how it's been adopted by organizations, and why it's now being embraced so readily, not only in North America, but globally. And then the second half of the presentation is more about how it links with, integrates with, and supports information security management. And there's three different ways that happens. And I thought that might be, once we've got the context and the background out of the way, that might be where your audience would be particularly interested.
That would be great. Now, do you have this PowerPoint slide presentation somewhere where we could link to it so that people could follow along?
I don't right now, but if you guys want to make it available to your audience, that's perfectly okay with me.
Well, actually, I am wondering why you haven't submitted this for a talk at a security conference, because this, if you fleshed it out a little bit, I could very much see this at a DEF CON or a B-Sides type security conference.
Let's make it happen.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we can find a B-Sides that's coming up soon that if you don't mind a little travel, you could go to and do a call for papers on. So if you're going to go to, if you like to go to Louisville and in September, you could go to DerbyCon with us. We're going to be at DerbyCon. So
that would be great, Brian. Thanks very much for the invite.
Well, there's a little bit more than just me inviting you. Got to have to.
I like that. He kind of slipped that in for.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, let's get started. I mean, this is great. We'll either link it on our cast later or whatever. You can put it on SlideShare. We'll put the links or have it on our website or whatever you guys work out. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So should I just get started then, Brian?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
If try to keep in mind that people who are trying to follow along with the PowerPoint, just let them know when you're going to be changing slides or something. Just say slide 3 or slide 4 or something like that. If there's not too many of them.
Okay, will do. So the first slide is the title. So let's move on to slide number 2. When talking about the background to ITIL and how ITIL came to be formed, we really need to cast our minds back to the situation in the 1980s. And so slide 3 talks about the background to the need for ITIL. Really, three major things were happening back in the 1980s. First of all, organizations were becoming ever more reliant on the services that IT provides. At the same time, the complexity and sophistication of IT infrastructure and IT environments was growing. And there were number three, there were ever increasing demands on IT departments to provide robust and predictable levels of service provision. So in the early 1980s, it was still theoretically possible, for example, for an accounting company to use ledgers, giant leather-bound books, not literally with quill pens, but paper and pen. That situation is absolutely impossible these days. In the days of kind of real-time transactions and immediate need for management information, reports, and metrics, that is no longer sustainable.
Yeah.
And so,
yep.
Yeah, that situation started to develop in the early 1980s, and the business's reliance on IT was growing in two different ways. First of all, internal members of staff needed to know when they arrived on site in the morning that the services that they need to do their jobs would be up and available and would stay available during core business hours. In the same way, external customers who grew to rely on things like custom company websites and the functionality of those websites, they had expectations of 100% availability. So I'm on slide 4 now, by the way. And an example of that is, let's talk about Expedia. If you went to Expedia to book a holiday, book a hotel, whatever, and the Expedia website was down, one of three things would happen. Either you would not get to book your vacation, or you would have to go to a competitor, hotels.com or whoever, and make your booking through them. Or, going on to slide 5, you would end up being a very angry customer. And all three of those situations is bad for business, because as we can see on slide 6, the implications of those three situations are bottom line implications. They all end up costing an organization money. And because that's the reason that we're all in business, the need to provide robust and predictable levels of service, IT services, grew and grew and grew since the 1980s onwards.
Now, in the 1980s, though, the IT was way different. I mean, you mentioned financials, and when you mentioned that big leather-bound ledger, I remember the movie Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, where Christina Applegate's character had to do the yearly report or something, and the lady came in with this stack of dot matrix reports, and it was in this fancy leather-bound volume. That I remember that. So I remember seeing that. So, but back in the day, it was mostly dumb terminals and big iron, right? I mean, they didn't have personal computers, so the idea of IT is not nearly the same as it is today, right?
No, you're absolutely right. And but think back to the 1980s. If you're old like me, and you were actually working in IT in the early 1980s, you will probably be very familiar with a situation where if a service that you needed in order to do your job became unavailable, or you had some kind of breakage of a piece of IT infrastructure, you would call up IT operations, and some unkempt youth would emerge from the bowels of the IT department, and it was always a guy back in those days, and with barely a grunt of acknowledgement, he'd come to your terminal or your, whatever piece of equipment was broken, and he'd fix it for you, and then kind of slouch off back to to his proper job, usually in the basement of the building. Now that's a gross generalization, but it will be very familiar to a lot of people. It led to a perception of IT which was not good. It led to the perception of a big barrier between IT and the business, of people in IT not really understanding or caring about the business of the business. They only cared about IT. They talked in technobabble. They were generally geeks, had very little in the way of interpersonal skills, and were devoid from the aims and objectives of the business. That was a situation that was unsustainable. IT had to become a business partner. And that was another thing that developed during the 1980s, and which also led to the need for best practices and for ITIL in particular.
Okay.
Now, is ITIL more of a mesh between IT and business, kind of going on the business model, the old mature way of doing business? I mean, it was this new thing that came about, but yet it had such immature practices, and it required some kind of a service management phase of it to kind of go in line with business. Is that what we're basically discussing here?
It does. The two main overriding objectives of all of the processes in the ITIL framework, and we'll come on to this in a minute, but that's basically what ITIL is. It is a series of best practices around multiple different processes undertaken within an IT department. The two main overriding objectives of every one of those processes are the integration of the efforts of IT with the business, and two, the enablement of the highest possible levels of IT service availability, because what that leads to is, first of all, IT being seen as a genuine business partner, and two, it enables the IT services that both internal members of staff and external customers have come to expect. There is an anecdotal story doing the rounds right now that when you download an app to your iPhone, and I realize we've jumped from 1982 through to 2015 here, but people are saying in the industry that new customers will decide whether they want to keep and use an app within 4 seconds of initially using it. That's the situation that we've got to. I mean, how far devoid from the big iron concept that Brian just outlined are we now? And it's only going to get more and more exaggerated as time goes on.
Yeah. So I have a question a little bit. Are we going to go into the history of ITIL? Because I had a question about you mentioning that you had started doing this in England and then moved over here when the U.S. started accepting it. Are we going to talk about that a little bit later on?
Yeah. Okay. Let's go ahead and do that right now.
Sorry.
So no, that's okay. So moving on to slide 7. That situation in the 1980s generated a need for requirements. Something had to change. So on slide 8, the very first thing that needed to change was IT had to change the way it thought. IT had to shift from a technology-driven to a service-driven approach. So when we're talking about an IT service, we're talking about everything from source to desktop. So a very typical example of an IT service is email. Internal members of staff need to have email available in order to be productive members of staff. So IT people have, since the 1980s, been encouraged to stop thinking of themselves as, hey, I'm a DBA, I'm a network guy, I'm a mainframe guy in the olden days. You know, I'm a telephony guy. Instead, everyone in IT needs to think of themselves as provisioning IT services to the organization internally and to customers externally. They need to understand their piece of the overall service provision jigsaw, but they really need to start to think of themselves as provisioning IT services to two different groups of people, rather than just being having a hard technical skill set. So what that leads to is the introduction in organizations of a service culture. And on slide 9, we talked about some misperceptions of IT back in the 1980s. And I mentioned that it was a gross generalization, but it's only ever a generalization if it's partly true, right? So IT needed to become a true business partner. And ITIL was conceived as a process improvement framework to allow that to happen, to enable the provision of IT services. On slide 10, another thing that needed to change was the whole technobabble comment. We needed a common language between IT and the business, because the only way for IT to become an effective business partner was to use a common language to enable effective communications between IT and the business. And that integrates the efforts of both parties. And then finally, on slide 11, management in organizations were becoming much more reliant on and demanding of correct, accurate, and timely management information, because only by providing that information could they make informed decisions. And so on slide 12, it was these requirements that led to the creation of ITIL. And now we move on to your question about the origins, Brian.
Okay.
In the mid-1980s, realizing the situation that we've just described was unsupportable, the UK government under Margaret Thatcher had an agency called the CCTA, and over time that morphed into the Office of Government Commerce, who is the organization that publishes the ITIL books. And they were tasked with developing a framework for the efficient and financially responsible use of IT resources within the British government. So that agency pulled together IT practitioners from all around the world, and on slide 14, after a period of several years, 5 or 6 years, their recommendations, which were all related to operational IT processes, were finally consolidated and published in a series of volumes. And on slide 14, as it says, the goal was to enable an IT organization to provide cost-effective quality services to the organization through the alignment of IT to business needs and the enablement of the highest possible levels of IT service availability. And this process approach allows the implementation of best practices independently from the structure of the organization. And pulling all of these different threads together on slide 15, what you can see is this generated ITIL version 1. And the reason that ITIL is called ITIL, which stands for the IT Infrastructure Library, is that all of the recommendations by this government agency were published in a series of 10 books, hence library. Each book contained guidelines about how to implement and operate a single IT operational process. One process, for example, was change management. What is the best way to enable change management, to implement change management in an organization such that it allows the integration of IT with the business and enables the highest levels of IT service availability? The same with capacity management, availability management, problem management, financial management, service level management. There were 10 different books, one for each one of the processes that constituted ITIL version 1.
Okay, so Tim, you mentioned there on the previous slide it was a cost-effective approach. Was there a reason that they added the cost effectiveness? Were they having trouble with the cost of IT at the time in the British government being extraordinarily high, or were they just trying to go, okay, well, we need it bigger, faster, and cheaper, and we're running all three at the same time, so we're going to try to use this ITIL to get all three of our eggs in the same basket?
To be honest with you, Brian, I don't honestly know the answer to that, but I'm sure it's a combination of all of those things. I know that Margaret Thatcher, for example, was very, very fiscally responsible, very much like Ronald Reagan in the US, and also very keen on measurements and service levels. Unfortunately, I'll tell you a funny story about that. It kind of backfired when it came to the British Meteorological Office, because Margaret Thatcher put performance measures on weather forecasting. And unfortunately, that drove the wrong behavior, because the meteorological office could quite honestly say sunny intervals and scattered showers every day in England, and they'd always be 80% right.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So it sounds like there's some key performance indicators and metrics. Metrics are very important in the ITIL process.
Yeah, it's one of 8 or 10 things that you will find common across every single book. Key performance indicators, critical success factors, metrics, recommended reports, processes and procedures, roles and responsibilities. They are the things that you will find for every one of the books. And as I said, each book represents a different operational process.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So over time, sorry. Slide 16. So ITIL is a best practices framework. It's based on the collective experience of commercial and governmental practitioners worldwide. and it describes all of the tasks and activities, inputs and outputs, entry criteria, exit criteria. And I say that deliberately because that talks to how ITIL can also be integrated with CMMI, for example, to allow for maturity assessments to be undertaken. Each IT organization has a need to implement ITIL processes in a way that makes the most sense to it. If anyone listening to this webcast ever hires an ITIL consultant and they hear that person say, you need to do this because it's in the books, that consultant doesn't know what they're talking about. I'm serious. The ITIL books were deliberately written in a way so that you could adopt a greater or lesser extent of all of the recommendations in the books and allow the adoption of those recommendations to be undertaken in the way that the organization requires.
So you can do partial implementations all the way up to a full implementation, and you're not wrong or you're not necessarily right either.
That's right. Some of the recommendations make absolute sense to organizations. Some simply don't do because of the culture or the business that they're in. You may need, for example, and we come on to this in a little while, to ensure that when you build your processes, they also meet the needs of other federal requirements, compliance and governance requirements. If you're in the financial services industry, you have a different set of requirements to if you're in the medical field, for example. Mm-hmm. ITIL allows you to pick and choose the recommendations that you choose that make sense for your organization.
Okay.
That kind of goes contrary to what I was told, that it takes a lot of, I guess, capital or funding in order to implement ITIL correctly, because there will be some new jobs that have to be put in place. You need a process owner for each one of these processes you implement, right? I'm not saying that that's an entire job in and of itself, but somebody needs to be designated as that process owner, and that does take time, and that will increase your labor force, right?
You're absolutely right, Brian. You alluded to an answer to your own question there, which is you have to differentiate between jobs and roles. An analogy is wearing different hats. You're absolutely right. Once you've implemented a problem management process or a change management process, it doesn't end with the implementation. You have to make somebody the process owner so that they are responsible for the institutionalization of that process, to ensure that the metrics and the key performance indicators related to that process meet the benefits that you've implemented the process to achieve. That you undertake continual improvement of the process over time. Once it's implemented, it's not written in stone. And this is especially true for information security, because for example, the process has to be fluid enough to adapt to new threats. And that's true across all processes. That process owner, though, that, as you said, that doesn't have to be a full-time job. That is a role that somebody else within the IT organization will take on board in addition to their normal job. And typically that role in the early days of implementation can take up about 5% of a person's time.
Mm. Yeah. And plus, like information security, when you have access controls or something in place, the people who are giving the control, you have to watch those people and make sure, you have to do audits on those people to make sure that they're doing the process properly. Just like with ITIL, when you do change management, the people who want the change can't also be the people who are approving the change necessarily. You've got to have more than one person. If you've got a guy with multiple hats, like, a guy who wants the change, you've got to have another guy who makes the change and approves the change. The guy who wants the change in the first place could also be the person who is going to implement the change, but you got to have that kind of audit trail to allow for, your proper change management procedures.
You make two great points there, Brian. The first one is the process owner is also responsible for ensuring process maturity and adoption. So you have to make sure that people do not go around the process once you've implemented it. The second great point is you're absolutely right. In some federal requirements, in some governance and compliance requirements, especially in the financial services industry, as a result of some of the scandals from the 1990s and the introduction of Sarbanes-Oxley and what have you, you're absolutely right. The same person cannot build and test and implement a solution. There has to be segregation of duties to make sure that people aren't gaming the system and undertaking activities that they shouldn't be.
Yeah, and segregation of duties is one of the part and parcel ideas in security. You want to make sure that people are, you have that segregation and that people are being watched and making sure the processes work. So. That's quite interesting how everything's just kind of sliding into place, for the later parts of your slideshow here.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to slide 17. So ITIL doesn't provide any restrictive guidelines for process implementation. Each one of the books contains a raft of recommendations, and organizations are able to adopt a greater or lesser degree of each one of those recommendations in a way that makes sense to it. The approach is known as non-prescriptive. So ITIL explains what you should do, doesn't actually tell you how to do that, which was lucky for me because it enabled me to set myself up as a consultant to help organizations undertake ITIL implementations. And moving on to, let's talk a little bit more about how ITIL version 1 then evolved over time. Because moving on to slide 18, after a period of time, ITIL version 2 came along. And ITIL version 2 really took the 10 core volumes from version 1 and put 5 of the books into one new book and 5 of the books into another new book. And on the slide here, they're the 2 boxes right in the very middle, service support and service delivery. ITIL started to be really adopted at that point, most critically in the UK and in Holland, not just by government organizations, but private companies started to adopt best practices too. And what they found was, hey, there's a whole bunch of missing information here. First of all, as we were talking about a minute ago, there's no guidelines about how we take these recommendations and implement them in our own organization. And so another book was written called Planning to Implement Service Management, which gave some, for the very first time, gave some hard and fast recommendations about how to use ITIL and how to implement and operationalize the ITIL best practices. Another 2 critical books that were missing were The Business Perspective and Infrastructure Management. Finally, Application Management, which was never really covered in ITIL up until this point, an application management book was written. And then finally, of most interest to you guys, a final core volume, Security Management, was added to the library. So in the mid-1990s, the 10 core version 1 books were consolidated down into 2 volumes, and another 5 volumes were added. And by the mid-1990s, we'd got to 7 books, and that's known as ITIL version 2.
Okay, so on ITIL version 1, it was more mission-based, like, okay, you need to get to this point. It doesn't really matter how you get there. It's just you're supposed to get to the top of the mountain. But it was too free form for a lot of businesses, so they decided, well, version 2, we need to be a little more specific. Maybe have some recommendations about how to implement and get to the top of the mountain. And we forgot how we're actually going to travel to the top of the mountain, so we're going to give you infrastructure, instructions and things like that.
Yeah, it was all of that, Brian, and an acceptance that the scope of ITIL version 1 was now too small. The early adopters had taken all of those recommendations and done as much as they could with them, and realized that there was there were massive chunks of IT that were still missing. How do I manage my infrastructure? How do I undertake application development? How do I truly build this relationship with the business? How do I implement all of this stuff? And then finally, how do I keep my environment secure once I've done all of these things? And so you're absolutely right. And there was an acknowledgement that the scope needed to grow. This was a great idea, but we really needed more recommendations about more areas of interest and use to IT.
Mm. It's interesting how the mid-90s, they started thinking about security at the time because, the rise of the hackers and people, doing financial fraud and those kinds of things. They needed to tack on security at the end, just like they normally do. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, moving on to slide 19, ITIL started to grow. As a result of the introduction of ITIL version 2 in the mid-1990s, so ITIL had its roots in the 80s. It started to become more widely adopted in the mid-1990s. It spread from the UK to European organizations and then across the Atlantic to North America. Now, one of the key reasons, moving on to slide 20, that the US market started to adopt ITIL was because US organizations, I'm going to do another gross generalization now, but they seem to be more conservative with a small c. They like to know that things are going to be successful before jumping in and really embracing them. And so it was as a result of the early adopters in Great Britain and Europe showing measurable improvements and benefits as a result of adopting ITIL that really started to appeal to US organizations. And coincidentally, at exactly the same time, there were a whole bunch of federal government requirements, things like HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley, which were being imposed on organizations. And those organizations found that they were much more able to adopt and adhere to the requirements of these regulatory requirements if they had already adopted best practice-based ITIL. So it was a perfect storm. The ITIL version 2 books were published at exactly the same time that the US really needed them. And so, voila, ITIL crossed the pond.
Very nice. So some of the first implementers of ITIL were, say, hospitals and financial institutions, and for good reason, because they were bound by Congress to have some way to manage and to get to HIPAA compliance or get to SOX compliance. So they had to have indicators and metrics and those kinds of things to help do that. And ITIL was the way they went with that.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Okay.
And just to complete the story, on slide 21, ITIL version 3 came along in 2007, and it was refreshed again in 2011. They decided the publishers of ITIL decided not to call it ITIL version 4 at that time because it wasn't really seen as a whole version increase. So the 2011 version was known as the ITIL refresh. And what they did here was they took all of the volumes from ITIL version 2, compiled them down into 4 main volumes: service strategy, design, transition, and operation, introduced a whole bunch of new processes into those books, and then overlaid continual service improvement as a 5th and final volume on top of the 4 existing books, and based those books around the concept of a service life cycle. So from strategy through to post-implementation, continual improvement. And that's the stage that ITIL's at the moment. There are now 5 ITIL books. You can see them on this slide here, number 21. And on, I believe, in a couple of slides, actually on this slide, you can see the main processes that make up each one of those life cycle phases comprised in each book. For example, service design, you'll see in red supplier management, service level management, service catalog management, and availability management, and so on and so forth. So all of the different processes are now within those 5 volumes.
So they tacked on continual service improvement. Could you give us an example of what that was? Is that one of the colors on the wheel here?
So yes, it's the one that's right on the outside of the graphic, and it's all about understanding that really process improvement is a never-ending journey. Once you've spent all of this time and effort and money creating your new processes, training your workforce, embedding them in IT service management tools, which allow the automation of manual administrative tasks and underpin the processes, they are not set in stone at that point. They need to be continually improved. Metrics and key performance indicators need to be monitored. Tweaks and updates and need to be made to the process in an ongoing fashion. And the continual improvement book explains how to do that most effectively.
Sure, and that's when you mentioned earlier about using the CMMI model for maturity, because once you get to a certain point in your process, you've basically got to go back and like levels 4 and 5 are making sure that your process works properly, that it's as efficient as it possibly can be. And then like level 5 is bringing someone in to make sure that you're actually monitoring your processes properly. So you're always going to be doing continual process improvement, and part of the maturity of a model is making sure you're constantly improving the process and measuring that.
You're exactly right. Level 5 of CMMI is optimized, but of course there's a dirty secret to CMMI, which is if you have a crappy process, which is which is well adopted and understood and mature and completely embedded in an organization, you can get to CMMI level 5, but you'll get crappy results from it.
Really?
The great thing about merging an ITIL as a process improvement framework with CMMI is that you're very confident right at the start that you're building a good process to start with. And so you're going to optimize a good process rather than a suboptimal process.
Sure.
Yeah.
So is ITIL very similar to how people use Lean Six Sigma? Because this is about process improvement as well. Is that another type of process improvement framework, or can you use Lean Six Sigma and ITIL together?
You can. There's actually a very interesting white paper out there called, I think it's called Six Sigma and ITIL Together Again for the First Time, which is a very interesting title. And it explains how different frameworks and best practices can be merged together to give a more optimized output. I think it still depends a little bit on what industry you're in, because Six Sigma is very much about driving out defects.
Sure.
So yes, they absolutely can be amalgamated together if necessary, depending on the industry that an organization is in.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So slide 22 really summarizes everything that we've really just talked about ITIL. It's a customizable framework. It's non-prescriptive, so it tells you what you should do, but allows you to choose an implementation method that works for your organization. It's applicable to any industry, any size of organization, any culture. It focuses IT on business and corporate objectives. It encourages IT and the business to integrate their efforts together and enable the highest possible levels of service availability. It shifts IT from a technology approach to an IT service provision approach. It introduces a common language, improves efficiency, increases effectiveness, and reduces risk. It improves service quality and performance. And finally, at the end, it allows for complete and accurate management information as a basis for decision making.
Now, Tim, that sounds like a sales pitch. I mean, it sounds like it just gives you everything you could possibly want. But ITIL is hard. It's hard to implement, right? It's hard to get right. I'm sure once you get it right, I mean, it streamlines things to make them much more effective. But it requires a huge investment. I think we have 3 different points of view on the podcast right now. we've got you, the guy who's an expert at it. We've got me. I've been trained on it. I've got that foundation that you talked about earlier. And then we've got, of course, Brake. He doesn't know anything about it right now. But what about the ITIL guy, or what about the guy who hates it, right?
Okay.
Or who has used it or tried to use it and just thinks it's a waste of time? Have you ever run into anybody like that?
Yeah. So you bring up some great points, Brian. Let me address a few of them. The intent of this slide is not to be a sales pitch. I'm nothing to do with publishing the books. I wasn't involved in the construction of the books, but I believe absolutely in the benefits that the ITIL framework can bring to any organization, because I have seen those benefits actually happen in reality. The organizations that have the biggest difficulty adopting ITIL, or adopting any kind of best practices, but especially ITIL ones, fall really into three areas. One, where they have no real structured processes in place at all. Now, that could be because they're a startup organization, they've grown very, very quickly, and they've had a need to grow their IT and grow their business rapidly without necessarily acting like cowboys gives the wrong impression, but a lot of organizations simply grow so fast that they don't have time to document what they've done as they've grown. Those are the organizations that have the most work to do in terms of documenting and adopting best practices. First of all, because the documentation can potentially take a long time, but secondly, because you have a culture problem to overcome. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the big cultural problems in most organizations that I've worked is around change management. Very often, if I work in an organization that has either non-existent or very immature change management processes, the change implementers will quite rightly say to me, this change that I need to do will take 2 minutes. You're asking me to take 20 minutes to document and get communicated to, and let the whole world know what's going on. That's crazy. All you're doing is wasting my time. People who build and implement change management processes really need to understand that there are three equally important factors to change management. One is adopting best practices, one is reducing risk to the organization, and the third is enabling the business of the organization. And no one of those should be any more critical than any of the others. They are all equally important. I'll give you an example. Opening a port on a firewall, that takes 5 seconds. Should you do it without a change record and without everybody knowing about it and without executive management approval? No, absolutely not. There has to be a balance, though, between the paperwork necessary to get the change done and the actual implementation of the change itself. Couple of other kind of cultural things that organizations that find it more difficult to adopt best practices are, in my experience, the state agencies, because they are traditionally much slower moving than privately held companies.
You don't say.
So it sounded as if you were going to ask me another question there, though, Brian.
Oh, no, go on. I do have a question that is in the front of my mind on what you just said, but go on with your statement. Okay. So, and the other type of organization where it can be difficult to implement best practices is an organization that hasn't done its research up front. Often I've gone into organizations and they'll say, give me $10,000 worth of ITIL and we'll see if we like it. It really doesn't work that way. In order to be successful, the highest levels, the C-level people in an organization really need to know all about ITIL to probably have worked in an organization that's adopted best practices in the past and seen the benefits, because they have to be an evangelist for this work. If they're not on board and if they're not evangelizing and really selling the need to do this,
then it's very, very difficult for a consultant just to implement best practices kind of from the bottom up. The final point that you made, Brian, was cost. And once again, you're absolutely right. Very often in organizations that where every team does, let's use change management again as an example, where every team has a different process for change management, uses a different tool for change management, where nothing's integrated, nothing talks to each other, and a decision is made that we need to migrate all of this stuff into a single enterprise-wide change management process supported by a single IT service management tool. That can be very expensive financially. It can take a long time, but it does pay for itself. At USAA, that we estimated that the benefits of the IT service management program to USAA were about $30 million over 5 years. And that's a significant amount of money.
So this is,
Wow.
you mentioned having C-level approval and having the C-levels being cheerleaders. We've mentioned that in our podcast about implementing security, security management, new security initiatives, and those kinds of things. If you don't have, the board or the head guys involved at the very beginning, you've almost doomed yourself to failure. So, Mr. Betcher, the guy who hates ITIL is probably either the guy who thinks that it takes too long to do changes, or he may be the guy who is, I would not say forced to implement it, but he might be the guy who doesn't see any need for it in his organization, but he may be only thinking in the short term instead of the long term.
Or he may be thinking instead of short term, long term, maybe small term as opposed to big term, I guess, if that's a term.
He's only thinking about his the
His
area
world.
around his house instead of the entire garden or whatever euphemism works there. I don't. I'm out.
Tim, you got anything to add to that?
No, except that, moving on to the next slide, which is number 23, as a result of the early adopters of ITIL really selling the benefits that they saw as a result of process improvement and adopting these best practices, ITIL is now the most widely adopted approach to managing IT services in the world.
So it's the biggest. It's like the service management, the big dog, right?
It is. And if you take a look at slide number 24, over 10,000 organizations globally have adopted ITIL, and ITIL is becoming increasingly integrated with other quality standards. We talked about CMMI already, but also COBIT, Six Sigma, Lean, Brian mentioned, and ITIL is now adopted across the whole world, and there's really no holding it back now.
Now, one thing that raised my eyebrows a while ago, and this was the question I had, you said that you should not implement a change without executive management knowing about it. Doesn't that go too high? Executive management knowing about a change?
Yeah, I misspoke. I was talking really about, the example I gave was opening a firewall port.
Yes.
You're right. Typically in an organization that you have a body for approving changes called the Change Advisory Board. And you're absolutely right, Brian. It's rare to have C-level people sitting on that board. It's usually mid-level and operational managers that are on that board. And so I absolutely agree with you.
Or, people awesome. that management has directed to be, their agent for change. So, in a startup, it may very well be a C-level person making, being the two levels up from me is a C-level person in my organization. So he would be the one to go ahead and approve those changes because that's just where he happens to be. I'm vulnerability management dude and the janitor, that kind of thing. So.
Okay.
So in larger companies, you would have either bidirection or somebody who's acting as an agent for that change as with the confidence of the C-level person involved.
So, if it's okay with you guys, that's really the part of the presentation that talks about what ITIL is, how it came to be, and how it came to grow and be adopted by so many organizations globally. But I'm sure your audience really want to hear the meat of this, which is, okay, so tell me about ITIL and information security management.
That is one reason, one facet that we had you in here. But actually, the whole ITIL part before that is very, very eye-opening as well. I didn't realize how, just from your discussion on how easily it could be integrated into information security. So I'm sure that they will enjoy that immensely.